The Pentagon Papers, officially titled Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, includes the 47-volume history of the role that the U.S. played in the Indochina region from World War II until 1968. The topic of Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers includes a vast and complex history that intertwines with many aspects of the Vietnam War. The papers were released by Daniel Ellsberg, who had worked on the study under Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Deputy Morton H. Halperin, and Director of Policy Planning and Arms Control, Leslie H. Gelb. In relation to the Vietnam War, the papers lay out missteps and possible mistakes that span over the length of 4 administrations. To better understand the intricacies laid out in these papers, it is best that the subject be explained into sections. These sections include the conception of the papers, what they entailed, the goal, the concealment, Daniel Ellsberg, and the impact. The conception of the Pentagon Papers can be traced back to 1967 when the former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara commissioned that a detailed study of the Vietnam War be constructed. McNamara has said that his goal or purpose was to create an encyclopedic history of the Vietnam War, claiming that he wanted a written record for historians to prevent errors in future administrations. However, because McNamara never disclosed the conception of the papers to the then-President Lyndon B. Johnson and Secretary of State Dean Rusk, many speculate that McNamara was going to use the papers as political ammunition for his close friend Robert F. Kennedy, who was going to go against Johnson in the 1968 Democratic presidential nomination. More evidence of this includes McNamara carrying out the study secretly, using special measures to avoid discovery by the White House. McNamara refused to use the normal unbiased historians and instead used his own trusted colleagues, John T. McNaughton, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and Morton H. Halperin, his deputy. McNamara assigned Leslie H. Gelb to direct the formation of the papers on a day-to-day basis. Under Gelb's leadership, it was decided that the team was to work without the aid of interviews, calls to military services, or consultations from any other federal agency. The only aid that was used came almost entirely from documents in the Office of the Secretary of Defense files. These restrictions led to speculation that the study was done with intentions to keep President Lyndon Johnson from canceling the project. The secret conception of the Pentagon Papers shows that even in its beginning, the project started off suspiciously. What they entailed. The papers included 47 volumes of top-secret sensitive material totaling 7,000 pages. Of the 7,000 pages, 3,000 pages were comprised of historical studies and narrative, with the remaining 4,000 being government documents. The papers were expected to use only around 6 people and would be finished in 3 months. However, the completion of the papers ended up taking a total of 18 months and used 30 more analysts than was previously expected. According to Gelb, the early portions of the papers concerning the years 1945 to 1961 tend to be generally non-startling, although there are many interesting tidbits. The most controversial information appeared in what followed, covering the Gulf of Tonkin, the bombing of Laos, and the death of No Dinh Diem. The goal. According to a national security memorandum in March of 1964, President Johnson's aim for the U.S. was to secure an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. However, in the same month, McNamara approved a statement written by his assistant, McNaughton, that the real goal of the U.S. in Vietnam was to not help a friend, but to contain China. On November 3, 1965, McNamara noted to President Johnson that China, being a communist nation and a fast-growing powerhouse, had the goal to unite all of Asia against the U.S. McNamara accused China of having imperial aspirations much like that of Nazi Germany. To further contain China and to lessen the impact of communism in Asia, McNamara proposed that the U.S. encircle China on three fronts. Because the USSR contained China on the north, McNamara proposed that the U.S. cover the Japan-Korea front, the India-Pakistan front, and the Southeast Asia front. In spite of all the planning, McNamara ultimately admitted that the containment of China would lead to a significant sacrifice of America's time, money, and human lives. In February of 1965, with a discouraging outlook on the war, McNamara approved that the reason behind continuing action in Vietnam was 70% to avoid a humiliating U.S. defeat, 20% to keep South Vietnam territory from the Chinese, and 10% to permit that South Vietnam enjoy a better life. The concealment. The Pentagon Papers revealed that the Harry S. Truman administration directly involved the U.S. in Vietnam by aiding France in its war against Viet Minh. They disclosed that President Dwight D. Eisenhower prevented communist takeover of South Vietnam and undermined the regime of Northern Vietnam. According to the papers, the documents reveal that in Operation Barrel Roll, the CIA was regularly using U.S. civilian pilots to fly U.S. planes to make airstrikes along routes in Laos. The Johnson administration was accused of deceiving the public in August of 1964 when the North Vietnamese PT boat attacked a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 5, 1964, McNamara was asked at a press conference if there had been any incidents involving South and North Vietnamese vessels. McNamara replied that there were none that he knew of. However, the Pentagon Papers reveal that the U.S. used South Vietnamese naval commandos to stage a raid on a North Vietnamese island in the Gulf of Tonkin. This raid was used to trick the North Vietnamese boats to mistake the U.S. destroyer for a South Vietnamese boat. This ruse was used so that the U.S. would have ground to attack northern Vietnam and enter the war. Daniel Ellsberg had worked in defense policy for years. He knew McNamara and was on a first-name basis with McNaughton and Gell. Ellsberg graduated from Harvard in 1952 and finished with a Ph.D. in economics in 1954. In the 1950s, Ellsberg served for 2 years as a Marine Corps infantry officer and later began working for the research and development organization RAND. From 1964 to 1965, Ellsberg worked under McNaughton as a special assistant to screen all information that came in on Vietnam. In 1965, he left McNaughton and began working for the State Department and was sent to Vietnam to work as a Foreign Service officer. Upon returning from Vietnam, he was hired by Geld to work on the Pentagon Papers. He worked on the Pentagon Papers for several months until going back to RAND in 1968. It was at this point that Ellsberg had been hardened toward the United States' role in Vietnam and was going to get the Pentagon Papers out somehow, even if it meant that he would go to jail. In 1969, Ellsberg was granted access to the Pentagon Papers and began copying them with his close friend Anthony Russo. Upon the completion of several copies of the Pentagon Papers, Ellsberg approached National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and Senators William Fulbright and George McGovern, but none of them were interested. It was then in 1971 that Ellsberg began discussing the papers with the New York Times. Ellsberg eventually gave 43 volumes of the study to the New York Times, and they began publishing excerpts on June 13, 1971. The impact. After the Times' third daily installment of the papers, the U.S. Department of Justice obtained a temporary restraining order against any further publication of the papers. Both the Times and the Washington Post, who also acquired the papers, fought the order through the courts for 2 weeks. On June 30, 1971, in what is regarded as one of the most influential cases in U.S. history, the U.S. Supreme Court freed the newspapers to resume the publication of the papers. The release of the Pentagon Papers caused nationwide and international controversy. It showed the growing failures of the United States' role in Vietnam and proved that there was a growing dissent over the justification of the U.S. action in Vietnam. The continuing of the publication of the Pentagon Papers only intensified the embarrassment of generations of administrations.